and welcome to New Heaven, New Earth. Last year, we did a program with Itzhak Bentov, a Boston-based researcher into the relationship between consciousness and the cosmos, and based upon a book which he wrote called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. This book has since become somewhat of a bestseller among people who are interested in the relationship between consciousness and the cosmos, and we wanted to, once again, get an opportunity this morning to speak with Mr. Bentov. Ben Bentov is a wonderful, loving, kind man, brave, courteous, true, all the other kind things you can say. The interesting thing about him is that he has, over the years, conducted research into consciousness. The subtitle of his book is The Mechanics of Consciousness, and what we want to try to talk about today is one aspect of it, and that is the evolution of consciousness. Ben, there's probably no theory that has had more impact on Western thinking than the theory of evolution that Darwin came up with in the mid-19th century. And ever since then, all of our thought has been along the ideas that somehow we have evolved as human beings to being who we are today. The question I want to ask you is, where do you see us now in that evolutionary development?
We can say that if we take Darwin's theories as being correct, then we know that we have evolved from the apes towards humans, and now we have finally come to a point where we're humanoid in shape, we have vertical spines, we're reasonably intelligent, we can push buttons on TV, drive cars, etc., etc. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to draw maybe a little diagram, but don't worry, it's not very scientific. Let me draw what is called a bell curve, which looks somehow like this. It's being used in describing random events. And the way this works is the following, that if we assume now, let's take a following situation. Take a little town that has maybe 1,000 people in it. And we have this great desire to find out what the average height of people in this town is. And therefore we go out with a yardstick and start measuring these people. Well, we find that a very small, very few number of people will be, say, 3 feet tall, and a very, very few of them will be maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. The bulk of the population will be right somewhere here. That is, the average or mean height of these people would be about 5 feet and 6 or 8 inches, something like this. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what we find here is that this bell curve gives us a good picture of where most of the population is. That is what typifies a population. We can use this diagram also to describe evolution. The bulk of the population today is this intelligent, more or less intelligent biped, all right? And with a vertical spine, and who pushes the buttons on TV and drives a car, etc., etc. Now, there is some backthrow. That is, there are some people here in this area, very few people who are still gorilla-like. That is, they are hairy. They beat their chest when they see their neighbors and a few other things. And then we have other people who are here in this corner, very few of them, who are very highly developed, because we say that evolution is now pushing mankind in this direction, away from the gorilla types towards the very highly evolved people. At this point, we're here. What's going to happen maybe 1 million years from now, 500,000 years from now? This curve is going to shift. It's going to shift like this. That is, the bulk of the population will be very, very highly evolved. We have gone away altogether from the gorilla types, no more gorillas. And what we have here now is the average man is now the retarded person in evolutionary terms. The bulk of the population is extremely, very, very highly evolved. And the cutting edge of evolution here, these are very, very highly evolved people. We can't even imagine what kind of person that will be. He may not have a physical body at all. What's the habitat, so to speak, of this group here? Well, you just go out and you find them. They're all over the place. The habitat of this group here, what do you think? Where do you think you find these people here?
I suspect that you would find them in universities. You'd find the people who are very bright, people who are in the leading edge of professions. That kind of thing. I mean, it's an intellectual thing, isn't it?
Well, I suggest that you find them in mental hospitals, in nut houses. And the reason for that is that these people, they live in a different reality, in a reality which is very changed, and few of them are adapted to live in this reality, so naturally they can't function very well. So the only safe place, only good place for them would be the mental hospital, unless they can integrate their different view of reality with their daily lives. Now, if they can integrate it, then we have people like Newton, like Darwin, like Faraday. These are the so-called geniuses.
The thing that I'm not certain that we have talked about is, what is it that is evolving?
Let's put it this way. The nervous system is the thing that is evolving, and the nervous system is supported by a skeleton of bones and muscles and tissue, etc., etc. Now, the nervous system is that thing that gives us the picture of our realities. That is, our realities, that reality which you see all around you, the flowers and the chairs and the microphones and the teacup, is given to us by our senses.
Yeah.
We don't see light which is beyond UV and beyond infrared. We hear only a limited scale of vibrations, like, for instance, we hear anywhere from 52 to 20,000 maximum. In other words, all our senses are limited. So, with these limited senses, we naturally are seeing through a very narrow kind of tube or very narrow slit in the total reality there is. Now, as you're evolving, what happens is that slit opens up more and more and more. So you see more and more of that reality, and we assume that we see different realities. They're not very different realities, but rather a very extended, broad view of one very large reality. The Bible mentions maybe 4 to 6 colors maximum.
Yeah.
That is what people saw just bare maybe 4,000 years ago. Nowadays, we see hundreds and thousands of colors. That is, our visual system has evolved. Our fellow mammals, like cows and horses, see only black and white. So this is one example of the evolution of the nervous system. The senses are an extension of our nervous system. Our eyes, our ears, etc., are an extension of our brain, so to speak.
Okay, so now, before you were talking about the people who were the mutants, either being in the mental hospitals or being geniuses. These are people who have expanded perception, and hence they can see a reality which ordinary people at this stage of evolution are not able to see.
Correct.
What is the nature of that reality which they're able to see?
Well, that is classified as a non-physical reality sometimes. We can take an example. Say, well, let's take a simple example. The family sitting at dinner table, and say there's a kid, maybe 15 years old, 16 years old, and he looks up and suddenly he says to his mother, "Hey, Ma, look at, there's our dead grandmother is standing in the corner." Mother looks around and says, there's no grandmother there. And she says, "Well, kiddo, there's something wrong with you. You need help."
You're crazy.
So you're crazy. So she takes him off to the friendly neighborhood psychiatrist, and same thing happens. The psychiatrist will ask him, "Well, kiddo, what do you see?" Well, you'll see, "Well, don't you see, doctor, over there in the corner, don't you see this person standing there?" Well, the psychiatrist turns around, "No, there's no such thing." Well, and then psychiatrist says, "Oh, young fella, you're in troubles," and then he writes out a little prescription for a little Thorazine or electroshock or whatever, and pretty soon, in a matter of 2 weeks, kid is back in shape, very normal.
No longer sees the...
No longer sees anything.
Yeah.
So the process has been reversed. This is called a psychotic episode, or acute schizophrenic break, or whatever it is.
And what you would say is that there's a good chance that that kid is seen.
Very good chance that the kid has a spontaneous opening of his senses.
So that the evolution has been rushed up or hurried up?
Yeah. Now, this actually happens. There are techniques to do this. But the Eastern people, the yogis, have developed systems to do this, to push the nervous system rapidly. But it happens very often spontaneously without someone trying to do anything about it. And it just happens. And then, naturally, in the olden days, these kinds of things used to be called miracles.
Yeah.
And nowadays, there's no more miracles. Well, let's take this.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because you think of, what you call the spontaneous opening of expanded awareness.
Correct.
Right? I mean, that's sort of a lot of words to say something. But in an earlier time, it was called a miraculous occurrence.
Yeah.
Elevated consciousness.
Right.
A time of great revelation, of God speaking to you.
Now, take like this fellow, St. Paul, yeah? He's going or walking or riding to Damascus in the olden days. And suddenly this big ball of white light descends, and Jesus standing in the ball of light, and he says, hey, why don't you lay off of my people and stop doing whatever you're doing and all that? And he's very impressed, and he's even blinded, and he falls down, and one thing and another. But anyway, he makes it somehow to Damascus, and there he starts a big campaign, and he talks about his experience and the big public relations thing, and he got the thing going. He got the church built, and the Judeo-Christian ethic came out of this, and bingo, and all the things that, that go with this. So we've got something.
Yeah.
Now, suppose the same thing would happen, and this fellow, so St. Paul, say, is driving down on Route 128, yeah? Driving down.
Route 128 doesn't go to Damascus.
Well, it doesn't go to Damascus, it goes to
It goes to Dedham.
So, okay, so then this fellow is driving, and suddenly this big ball of light descends in front of his windshield, and there's Jesus standing in front of him, and he gets very, very impressed, and his driving naturally gets kind of wobbly. And so, sure enough, there's a cop behind him, and he says, ooh, and gets him off to the side of the road. And he says, sir, may I have your license and registration and all that? And this fellow is so impressed, and he keeps babbling something about Jesus and all that. And the cop says, well, you must be driving under the influence, right? So he arrests him and takes him in the station. Then what happens is that he comes to the station, and then they tell him, well, he still is under the influence, you see. So they call an ambulance and send him off to the mental hospital. So now the reception desk, they interview him, a very short interview, and the guy puts down in the logbook that the fellow came in with an acute psychotic or schizophrenic episode with religious overtones. That's it. And this is what we did to the miracle. So we took the miracle and we ground it down really to gray powder. So no more miracles.
Okay.
Everybody's complaining that during the Bible times, on every page of the Bible you have a miracle or two, and now there's no miracles. This is what we're doing to the miracles. We're just flattening them out.
What is it that is evolving? Now, you talked about the nervous system evolving, right? But is there something else that is evolving that is able to be sensitive to this higher level of reality?
We have this notion of the soul. Most people weren't talking about the soul. It's a kind of non-physical thing, it's highly theoretical. And so when you go to church, you take this soul out of the closet and polish it up a little bit, and then you go to church and you are one with your soul. Then you come back and put it back in the closet till next week. So that's about the idea of a normal person, the soul. But actually that's not the case. I mean, we don't have souls, but it's just the other way around. A soul has us. So that is that thing that evolves, the permanent, eternal thing is the soul, and the body is a kind of disposable thing. That is, you use a body like a car for 80,000 miles, 100,000 miles, and you junk it, and that's it, you get another one. So it's the driver is the soul who uses the body for a while, and then he runs it into the ground, and he gets another one sooner or later.
And so it's the soul which is experiencing evolution, and not our personality, not our physical existences.
That is, the soul is the repository of information that we gather during a lifetime. Well, I'll tell you, maybe we should draw another diagram. Physical bodies are here, another physical body, and this is Joe, and this is Jim, and this is Sarah, etc. Now, clearly, this is the physical level, yeah? Now, on this physical level, we're all separate. You sit there, and I sit here, and we're all separate. Now, let's draw another level. This level is slightly higher, and let's call this the level of the soul, yeah? Well, there will be some mingling here. Let's draw this person as extending to practically infinity this way. Now look what happens. At the physical level, we're separate, and there's this much distance between us. Let's say that on the soul level, this person extends this much, and the other person gets slightly mixed in with him. That is, the souls are, in a way, in touch with each other. Okay, they overlap, these two lines. Now let's go now to a higher level, and let's call this, say, the level of the higher self, which is kind of a boss of that soul. There, what we find is that this fellow's higher self extends this much, and the other fellow's extends this much. There is more overlap between them.
Right.
On the very highest level, which is the high spiritual level, we are basically overlapping completely. Everybody is overlapping everybody else. In other words, everything and everyone is everywhere. In other words, we've become omnipresent. This is a state of highly spiritual, perfected beings, or gods, you may call them. Okay?
Okay, and so that we exist on all of those simultaneously.
On all of those simultaneously,
So then,
but we're not aware of that.
In your view, then, if when we see each other as separate entities, that's only seen on one plane of reality.
Correct. And so whether we like it or not, we're all evolving towards godhood. But, you know, it takes eons, so don't hold your breath.
Is that the purpose of evolution?
Naturally. Because at that point, you start understanding how the system works. And one of the good things about this system is that the system wants to teach you about itself.
What does
It's
it
a
want to
good
teach
system.
you? Yeah?
Yeah.
What does it want to teach you?
Well, if you are omnipresent and you're all-knowing, that is the state which the system wants you to be in. Because the system is an intelligence or information-gathering system. And it's also freely distributing that information.
In your view,
Yeah.
we all started off somewhere a long time ago in which there was sort of undifferentiated matter, which slowly, millions and millions and millions of eons, evolved until a very complex organism that we now call a human being. And it has a nervous system which we at this particular point in time understand as being sensitive to certain levels of reality through our eyes, our ears, our nose, other sensory perception. And that's sort of what we call material, ordinary reality that enables us to drive cars and do our work every day. However, there is an evolutionary movement that will continue to push us beyond where we are today. And the thing which is going to be pushed is our soul, and that at some point we will have these experiences of elevated consciousness in which higher realities are not only seen but lived, and ultimately we come into perfection.
Whether we like it or not.
Yeah? Can we speed that up by doing anything?
Yeah. Well, you use the meditative techniques which push the nervous system a lot faster than the normal evolutionary rate. Those techniques are available, but you don't need to do anything. It's going to happen anyway.
It's going to happen. What a view. It's a very big, bright view.
His full name was pronounced Itzhak Bentov, But to most people, he was known simply as Ben. Ben would usually start his talks by saying, "Now we will talk about all there is, from atom to cosmos, from humanhood to godhood, no less." And he would talk about the nature of reality and our place in it, and his own model of the universe, and his personal experiences in expanded states of consciousness. And finally, at the end, the ultimate question: who runs the show? Ben had a tremendous sense of humor and a capacity to explain very complex ideas in a very simple and understandable way. And he illustrated his 2 books with his own cartoon-like drawings. Niels Bohr has said, "Some things are so serious that one can only laugh about them." Ben called himself a nuts and bolts man, a plumber. He was trained as a mechanical engineer, and somewhere along the way, he started meditating, and his consciousness opened up, so that reality began to be perceived by him in 2 ways, 2 kinds of knowledge: the linear, scientific, objective knowledge, and the direct, intuitive, inner knowledge of a mystic. And the combination of these 2 gave him a unique and a very unusual perspective on the nature of reality. First of all, he saw reality as a hologram. It's a totality in which every part is related to every other part, and they're all interdependent. And this hologram he perceived as vibratory in nature. In other words, as he said, it's an off and on reality, and we are only part-time here. It's an oscillating field. And it may appear to us as a continuous reality, whereas in fact, it's like a film composed of separate frames. He looked at reality as a whole as consciousness itself. Consciousness in the state of evolution, of unfolding itself to know itself. And there is nothing outside it. So that the physical reality, the manifest world, is only another expression of that reality, which is consciousness, or existence itself, aware of itself. And matter is then another expression of consciousness at different levels of evolution, so that one can look at reality as being composed of an innumerable number of levels of reality, each level having its corresponding level of consciousness. And reality is perceived by those who are experiencing it only on the level of their own evolution of the nervous system. The mechanism in the physical body that perceives reality is the nervous system itself. And so, as a biomedical engineer, this is what Ben specialized in, he became interested in studying the effects of changes in consciousness on physiology. And I must say that Ben, whenever he talked about these matters, never claimed this to be any sort of ultimate teaching. He spoke about this as a working model. And he would say, "I speak from my present level of ignorance, because ignorance grows exponentially. The more questions you ask and the more answers you get, the more questions there are to ask. So it's an unending process of unfoldment of consciousness." And Ben saw reality, or I should say reality unfolded itself to him in the form of structure, because he dealt with mechanisms. To someone else with another background, reality would reveal itself in terms of, let's say, poetic metaphor or vibrations of different sounds to a musician, so that we all are like snowflakes, all similar, yet all different. And the subtitles of his two books actually indicate that reality appeared to him in terms of structure, because the subtitles are on the mechanics of consciousness and on the mechanics of creation. So Ben has designed instruments to study these physiological changes that occur in the body when a certain energy rises through the spine. In the East, it's called kundalini, or coiled serpent. It rises up the spine and awakens certain energies in the body, which allow perception to become broader, and the brain functions then on a different level. He called it his model of kundalini. Ben looked at reality as being driven by the force of evolution to infinity as consciousness unfolds itself. So in this graph, this arrow would represent the energy of evolution. And the bell curve, so-called, is a method to show graphically statistical data. And if the peak of this curve represents the average level of consciousness of humanity now, and the lower end of it shows the lowest level of consciousness, let's say the mafia types, as he used to put it, then the cutting edge here, the highest edge, would be individuals such as Einstein or Leonardo da Vinci. Now, as evolution pushes this ahead, some years from now, this bell curve will assume this position. So what will happen? That the average consciousness will be where the advanced consciousness is today. The low level will be where the average is today. And the high consciousness of humanity at that time will be something that we can hardly imagine. Because as he used to say, the potential of the human nervous system is enormous, and we really don't know where it's taking us from humanhood to godhood. And this chart shows an experiment that he did with a subject sitting on a chair that had a device attached to it called ballistograph. And the ballistograph is something that picks up micro vibrations of the body. So the large curve that you see reflects the motion up and down of the subject as the breathing occurs. And then the small wiggly lines superimposed on that indicate the heartbeat. The lower part of the chart shows the same individual in a state of deep meditation, which also means deep relaxation. And look what happened. The breathing is practically gone. It's a straight line. And what was a disrupted pattern of the heartbeat has turned into a regular sine wave. And looking at this as an engineer, Ben said, this is an effect of harmonization of all the frequencies within the body, and the body is now resonating like a tuned instrument. And he came up with what he called the Kundalini syndrome model. In other words, when this energy in the spine rises, the harmony occurs where the vibration turns into the sine wave at 7 cycles per second, or 7 hertz, as compared to the regular disrupted pattern. And as an engineer, he looked at the body in terms of vibrating systems or oscillators. And in this case, there are 5. The heart-aorta system, the brain itself, a cavity in the brain which is filled with fluid, a ventricle, and then the brain itself, the sensory cortex, and then all this results in an electromagnetic field around the head. A system which comes into harmony within itself becomes more powerful than others, and it will entrain, this is another term he used, it will entrain or pull after itself a system that is out of harmony. So once this oscillator or resonating system comes into harmony, it will trigger the rest one after the other. It's a domino effect. So as the heart pumps blood through the aorta, and he called the aorta the biggest plumbing in the body. So it's a tremendous impact on the body, and it shakes the body so that it vibrates. It hits the bifurcation into the legs, and a certain plane wave is reflected up. The next pulse comes down, and the plane wave and the pulse clash, and it creates a disruption in the body. When the harmonious 7 hertz vibration is set up, it seems that the heart and the lungs begin to talk to each other, and they begin to work in harmony, so that a pulse comes down and waits for the reflection to come up, and they both go up together, and then the next pulse comes down, and there is no clash occurring anymore, and the body goes into resonance, triggering the next oscillator, which is the brain. And looking at the head, again from the point of view of engineering, it's a rigid box resting on a resilient column, which is the spine. What happens is, as the body goes up and down, the skull is vibrated, and the brain, which is a gel-like substance, is floating in a fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid, so that each time the body goes up, it's hitting the skull and then goes down, and so up and down it goes, and it creates a plane wave within the brain. The brain has a characteristic called piezoelectric, which means that when it's stimulated mechanically, it develops an electromagnetic field around it, which is this field right here eventually. So this is the second oscillator, which triggers the third. This is the fluid-filled cavity in the brain called ventricle. And due to this regular vibration of 7 cycles, or 7 hertz per second, a standing wave is established in the ventricle, which again creates a very harmonious frequency. And this in turn triggers the sensory cortex. This is a cross-section of the brain, and this is a cross-section of the third ventricle filled with fluid. On top of the third ventricle is a drum-like surface with a bundle of nerve fiber crossing it, which connects the right and left brain hemispheres. And this is very important, because as the fluid vibrates harmoniously, it activates this nerve fiber, and it harmonizes the 2 brain hemispheres. And we know that consciousness opens up when the synchronization of the functioning of the 2 hemispheres occurs. And then a certain current is established in the sensory cortex in the lobe of the brain. And as I said before, all this results in an electromagnetic field around the head, so that the head actually becomes an antenna capable of sending out and receiving information which it could not do otherwise. And in that state, higher perceptions become possible. And this was Ben's theory, that through the mechanism of Kundalini and the resonant state of the body, higher perceptions become available. This is an illustration of the sympathetic resonance, how those oscillators trigger each other. If you pluck the strings of this violin, then the strings on this one will resonate without being touched. And this is how the oscillators relate to each other through resonance. And so, as we walk on this planet Earth, which is charged negatively, by the way, we are bathed in a sea of vibrations, of all kinds of electromagnetic fields and all kinds of frequencies, radio and others. And the ionosphere is charged positively, and the potential between the two is constantly fluctuating, so that we are subjected to all sorts of influences all the time. But in that state of resonance at 7 hertz, we plug into the vibration of the Earth itself, which is stable, and it happens to be the same 7 cycles per second, so that this biosphere around the Earth resonates at the same frequency, and we get locked into the frequency of the planet itself. And this is why the meditative state is such a relaxing state that some people find it difficult to come out of. Now, having become part of the vibration of the Earth, we then in turn plug into the vibration of the entire solar system, because our Earth here is shown surrounded by all kinds of vibrations as well. There is the magnetopause, magnetosphere, plasma sheet, you name it, trapped radiation. There are acoustical waves, the solar wind coming from the sun, which is also affecting the Earth, so that having tuned into the frequency of the Earth, we in turn tune into the frequency of the entire solar system and the sun, and so on into the cosmos. This is the cosmic connection. As Ben measured these fields around the body, he found that at that frequency of 7 hertz, the field around the body expands the energy that can be measured, and it extends to about 20 inches and tapers off. In a situation where there were hundreds of people meditating at the same time, Ben conducted an experiment because many of these individuals reported hearing inner sounds inside their heads. So when he measured the frequencies of the sounds that they heard, he found that there was one major sound and then other peaks where many people heard certain frequencies. And as he looked at this, and of course this is in kilohertz, as he looked at this, he realized that these other peaks are really the harmonics of the initial sound. In other words, everybody is really hearing one sound, but then it breaks up into harmonics, and some people hear entire chords. It really varies depending on one's evolution. This is how the third ventricle actually looks in the brain, and this is the cross-section of it that we spoke about. And on the brain, there is a narrow band called the sensory cortex. When stimulated mechanically with a needle, for example, during operations, it creates sensations in different parts of the body, and the sensations are laid out in this pattern, and this is called the homunculus, or the little man. And as you notice, the toes are inside the fold of the brain, and then the hip, the hand, and so on. The internal organs are here. So usually the signal goes to the sensory cortex and back to the motor system, telling the body what to do, how to react to the stimulus. But what happens in the Kundalini process, that this circuit becomes activated, and one begins to experience certain parts of the body spontaneously without them being actually stimulated physically. So one doesn't really know, is it happening in the brain or is it happening on the physical level? So eventually, as this current, and he really called it not a current, but an alignment of neurons due to the stimulation of the fiber here, the nerve fiber across the brain, this alignment eventually becomes a permanent situation, so that one's range of perceptions is tremendously expanded. And another thing that happens is that this current or alignment goes also through the pleasure centers, so that actually a person in this state is in a state of bliss, and a yogi sitting in a cave in Himalayas is actually having a lot of fun. So nobody's forcing them to sit for days on end cross-legged. And as Ben said, you can speed up the process of evolution, but we're all on this conveyor belt, and nature is carrying us along, and we will get there anyway, from humanhood to godhood, whether we like it or not. So eventually, as this current continues, starts at the toe and goes up around the body, and it opens up certain energy centers in the body known as chakras. And eventually the current begins to go round and round, and its function is to clear the body of stress so that it can actually perceive higher realities. And if there is a blockage anywhere, it will keep pushing through that until it's cleared so that it can actually go further. And some people can experience great discomfort because of that and not understanding what the mechanism is. And Ben wanted actually to inform the medical community, particularly the psychiatric community, about the phenomenon so that certain symptoms would not be misdiagnosed sometimes as they are as schizophrenia or actually some physical illness, which it is not. Certainly this mechanism and this phenomenon was known in antiquity, and this pharaoh is saying, my status symbol is this, that my kundalini has risen to the center in the forehead. And in this painting, it's being said, again, it's all coded in these graphic patterns. This is saying, my kundalini has reached this level and has gone even beyond the pharaohs. So this knowledge really was quite universal. Now we will continue, and we will look at the way Ben looked at reality. Because what is it that gives us our reality? And it was described in his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, on the mechanics of consciousness. And I will talk later why he used the pendulum as the symbol of what he was talking about. We are dealing with two realities. One is this physical, solid reality that we get blue and black marks from, as he said, when we bump into it. But the information about it is given us by our senses. So that is our subjective reality. And so the two really are giving us the totality of our environment. So what is the objective physical reality? And let us look at the atom. If we magnify the atom and zero in on the electron, and now we think now we will get the answer to what physical matter is. But if we analyze the electron, all we find is an oscillating electromagnetic field. There's no physical matter as such. So we think, well, maybe the nucleus will give us the answer. And we zero in on the nucleus, and we find that it too is only an electromagnetic oscillating field in the void, because between the nucleus and the electron and outside of them, there is nothing but void, the same void that fills in the interstellar space. And the ratio of the distance between the nucleus and the electron would be analogous to a head of a pin in the middle of this room and something rotating around it 30 feet away. And the rest is void. So what is physical matter? Ben drew an analogy between the electron and the pendulum by looking at the cross-section, as it were, of the atom and comparing it to reciprocal motion. In other words, we see the electron now on this side, now on the other side of the nucleus, which would be the pendulum motion. So what happens in the pendulum? It stops, it moves, stops, and moves again. In other words, it's action and rest, action and rest. If you took an actual pendulum and would swing it and attach a pin to it, and you would draw a piece of paper under it like this, it would describe a sine wave. Here the pendulum moved and stopped, moved and stopped. And reality really are the spaces between the points of rest. We perceive reality when there is motion. And reality is really nothing but oscillating fields in the void. And the reason I can touch this screen and I don't go through the floor is because my atoms, or the electrons of my atoms, are actually repelling the electrons of the floor. But if I would speed up my vibration, then I could very well go through the floor. So that it's the interaction between the atoms in this reality that gives us the illusion of solid matter. So how do we get information about this solid physical reality? It is through our senses, through the subjective reality. So let's look at that. How does the neuron work? If this is a neuron, and this is the baseline when the neuron is at rest, when it's stimulated by something, and it doesn't care whether it's a loud noise or a bright light, it simply says, ouch, I'm being disturbed. So the more such spikes you have on the baseline, the more intense the stimulus. But somehow through a miracle of our physiology, our brain can construct our reality out of these spikes that simply indicate a stimulation of the nervous system. And we see beautiful flowers and animals and the sky and so forth. And as we know, our senses are very inadequate. They're very limited and imperfect. Even bees, for example, can perceive ultraviolet light, and dogs can hear the ultrasonic. So that we see reality through our senses only through a very narrow slot. And the rest is really unknown to us. And so we're looking at the physical objective reality, which is oscillating, as we saw, through another system, our subjective reality through our nervous system, which also perceives it through action, rest, and action, and rest, and action, and rest. So one oscillating system is looking at another oscillating system, and the picture is very blurred indeed. We can extend our realities through instruments, telescopes and microscopes, but in the final analysis, it is only our senses that give us the knowledge. So our subjective reality then is the sum of impressions conveyed by our senses, coded in periods of action and rest, which are oscillating electrical states of the nervous system. And we're constantly comparing one thing to another. Otherwise, we would not perceive reality. For example, if the muscle of the eye is anesthetized, then we do not see anything, because the eye needs to scan all the time in order to see something. So, both realities become real due to a change occurring between two states of rest. When there is change, there is motion, and when there is no change and a total state of rest, then reality, as far as we are concerned, disappears because we cannot perceive it. So let's look at the overall picture. Here is the atom, and it can be represented as a sine wave of motion and rest, which is analogous to the motion of the pendulum. Now, let us take a hypothetical situation where we are taking a wavelength, let's say a red photon, which has a very large amplitude. The distances between the points of rest are very far apart. And then we take the same, let's say 1 inch, in other words, the same unit of frequencies, and we speed them up so that within the same length we have many more ups and downs, and let's say it's a violet photon, and then the points of rest get a little closer together, but we get more of them within that span. Then we speed it up even more, let's say the gamma rays or X-rays, and we see that we get even more spikes and or waves, and they get even closer together. Now, let us imagine a hypothetical situation where the speed has become so fast that it's become infinite. At infinite speed, there will be no more oscillation, and the points of rest will in fact overlap, and you would get a straight line. Now, what kind of state would that be? First of all, we see that it's a paradox, because the infinite speed now has become total rest. We could probably call it the state of the absolute. It's the source out of which all the frequencies arise. And it will also have the maximum energy. All energy is in it, but it's all in a potential state. And when it begins to vibrate, then it creates all these different frequencies which begin to interact, as we saw before, creating our reality. So one could summarize this by saying the absolute is the point where extremes merge, and a state of rest implies infinite speed. In fact, they become one and the same. And this state, the absolute state, is the substrate for all reality which emerges out of it. In particle physics, there is a principle of uncertainty which was formulated by Heisenberg, and it says, when the momentum or the speed of a particle is known, its position becomes unknowable. The more we know about one, the less we know about the other. Applied to the pendulum, what does it give us? When the pendulum stops before it reverses direction, we do know its speed because it's 0. And then it stops again and we know its speed again. So that means that at those points, its location becomes unknowable. And as Ben said, it can be found anywhere in the universe. That is, it becomes the universe. It fills all creation. It is everywhere. And based on this, he developed much of his further thinking. If this is our solid reality, and like a pendulum, we oscillate and we take off every now and then, and we touch that absolute state of total rest. But it happens so fast that we're not even aware of it. And we come back as if nothing had happened. But suppose we can expand that state and experience it, and in fact we can, then this is what will happen. Here is our reality, and here is the other reality, which we now have expanded. And we can be conscious on that level simultaneously with this level, so that we can actually have the benefit of both, and we can explore that reality and bring back the information. And this is in fact what Ben did, and the information that I will be talking about from now on was received in those states of expanded consciousness. Usually in those states of expanded consciousness, there is a different perception of time. People who come out of those states usually say, time has stopped, or at least it's slowed down. What is happening here? And to put it in some kind of perspective, Ben designed this diagram. This is our time-space, and this is the now moment where they cross, which is going from the past into the future, the eternal now moment. And we can project 1 second on it, 2 seconds on it, and so forth. It's very reliable, and we can measure it, and we can catch trains on time and be to work on time and so forth. However, superimposed on that are 2 other vectors of space-time, which are our subjective space-time. And usually they overlap, and we don't even know the difference. But in altered states of consciousness, there is a deviation. And by altered states, we can mean sleep or meditation or those deep altered states. And the angle of deviation actually determines the depth of that state. And look what happens. If we project 1 second, we see that now in this position of the subjective time, we have 2 seconds for 1 objective second, which means that our time has already doubled. Now visualize the situation where the subjective time tilts more and more and more, where it practically becomes parallel with objective space. And this is what it would look like. Our subjective time is now overlapping objective space. What kind of situation would that be? Well, it would take no time to go anywhere, because you are everywhere at once. because your subjective time has overlapped objective space and it's become infinite. This would be the state of samadhi, the ultimate expansion of consciousness, in which your consciousness fills the entire universe. Well, in those states, where does one go? There are many places to go. And again, to put it into some kind of perspective, Ben designed this diagram of the levels of consciousness in creation, because every level, as we saw before, reflects a state of evolution of matter on that level. And there is an indigenous population on all these levels that relates to that level. And our human band is only over here. So he looked at consciousness in its totality. If this vector here represents the quality of consciousness, this one represents the quantity of consciousness, or the capacity of a nervous system to react to stimuli. So here we put the atom, the virus, the plant, and an animal, and finally a human being. So this is where we are in the range of things, and there are many other levels above, and of course it's all going towards the ultimate state of the absolute that we talked about before, and they're all contained within it. Consciousness is modular. A larger consciousness contains a lesser consciousness. We also see here these curves, and these are called energy exchange curves, and they peak in the middle of each band, which means that the interaction with the environment here is the highest. And I find myself, and you find yourselves, in this physical reality because our energy exchange curve is highest in this level. However, we can also interact with the neighboring realities, but as you can see, the curve here tapers off so that we're not interacting as clearly and as well in those other realities, but still we do. And our nervous system is capable of spanning all these levels, except that we seem to be tuned only to this physical reality. And like a radio set, we can receive all the others, but we keep listening to this one. But it's up to us to tune into all the others as well. Now, the reality below us is the animal, plant, mineral. Those are the realities that Castaneda talks about, for example, in his books, the interaction with those realms. And the upper part is interacting with the next level to the human band, which is the so-called emotional level or astral. There are different names for these levels, and it doesn't really matter as long as we know what it means. And the next level is the mental, then the intuitive or causal, and so forth. There are certain characteristics about these levels, and we interact with all of them, and we can function in all of them. The one next to us is the emotional level, and this is where we go in sleep. As Ben said, this is a preview of coming attractions, because when we die, this is where we go, and we all interact on this level. The next level is the mental level, and emotions, in fact, are not allowed there, so that before you can cross the boundary, it's almost as if there is a customs official who says, any emotions to declare, and down you go if you can't release emotions that are negative. Actually, the emotions such as fear or anger. However, love, which sometimes is perceived as an emotion, is what Ben called is the glue of the universe. And without it, in fact, you can't even go higher. So when you abandon those emotions, you can enter the mental level, and here your reality is what you think. It is also so on our level, but to a lesser degree. But here you're actually creating your reality by what you think. The next level is the intuitive level, and this is where we all interact, and people of creative professions particularly visit those areas, and on that level they pick up a lot of information and they bring it down. The creative aha moment of discovery, for example, of an inventor or an artist, when suddenly a solution comes or an image comes, is in fact something that one perceived on this intuitive level. And as you saw before, our time expands on higher levels. So there was an enormous amount of time here to study the entire situation and then to bring it down. But when you bring it down, it appears like a flash, the aha moment, whereas in fact you spent a lot of time there getting ready for it. Our next subject will be a very important principle, the hologram, which is the basis of reality as Ben perceived it. And as usual, Ben had some interesting diagrams to explain his ideas, and he explained the hologram in terms of 3 pebbles being dropped into a pizza pan filled with water. And you drop these pebbles simultaneously into the water. What happens? Each pebble announces what happens to it. In fact, it's screaming, "Help, I'm drowning in a pizza pan." So it sends out these wavelets that reach every point on the surface of this water. And every pebble does that. So if we take this water now, which resulted in a pattern of wavelets that now clash into one another, all this information about the pebbles. And it's called the interference pattern. In cross-section, it would look like that. And if you quick freeze the water and you get a piece of ice like this, which is actually a photograph of all the information about these pebbles. And then you take what is known as coherent light, or light where all the rays are of the same frequency, a laser light, and you shine it through this interference pattern. Lo and behold, you see the 3 pebbles reconstructed 3-dimensionally in space. This is the important part of the hologram, that all the information is contained in this pattern, and every point of this pattern contains that information, because if by mistake you break this piece of ice and you end up with a little sliver of it and you shine the same light through it, you will still get your 3 pebbles. So this method of storing information is the most efficient way that nature has devised. And so Ben was a great believer and observer of the phenomenon of the relationship between the micro level and the macro level. When nature comes up with a method that really works, then it will be repeated on all these different levels, and we see more of that later. This is an actual photograph, if you can see it, of waves interacting with each other, creating this moire pattern of waves. It will actually look something like that. And here, if you shine this coherent light, the 3-dimensional object gets reconstructed. Now, if instead of those 3 pebbles, we substitute 3 individuals, because we, like the pebbles, are constantly sending out information about ourselves in a variety of ways. And all these fields are interacting, creating a hologram, an interference pattern, and you could say that human consciousness is one big hologram of information about humanity as a whole. We are one mind, one consciousness. And of course, the implications of this are stupendous, because if we realize that everything that we do, that we think, affects not only us, but everyone else, and not only everyone else in humanity, but it also goes beyond the boundaries of our planet. And another way of looking at this would be to see these 3 pebbles, or 3 separate individuals who feel themselves so isolated on this physical level. But if these lines here indicate ever-widening consciousness, we notice that on these higher levels, we begin to interact. So these 2 are interacting here, these 2 here, but all 3 are interacting on the next level. And if you visualize humanity being composed of these separate dots and billions of us, then on the highest level, we are all interacting and we are all one. And of course, you can look at it in reverse, that here's human consciousness, all one, and it sort of percolates down or dribbles down into these separate units, and we all think that we are so separate. And as we interact, we entrain each other. As we saw before, there is a principle of resonance and of entrainment or rhythm communication. In other words, a consciousness that has done its homework. This is a teacher, a guru, who has advanced somewhat beyond the others. Then his energy, his consciousness will be more coherent, it will be more harmonious, and like those oscillators that we looked at, it will entrain and pull after itself consciousnesses that are less evolved. So now in this next section, we will be looking at the model of the universe that Ben came up with as a result of his personal experience. But before that, we will look at the model of the universe according to the Big Bang theory as postulated by Gamow. In the infinite dark void, all energy, all space-time were condensed at one point, the cosmic egg. And this cosmic egg, for a reason we'll never know, exploded. And it exploded evenly in all directions, and the energy went out in the form of light radiation, photons. Gradually, stable particles were formed, protons, neutrons, and gases began to form. Helium and hydrogen gas were formed. And the gases condensed into stars with heavier elements forming in their cores. And the stars were condensing into galaxies, into clusters of spiral and other galaxies. And as the stars aged, they turned into red giants. And in dying, they would explode, scattering cosmic dust through the universe. And this cosmic dust containing heavier elements would condense again into clouds and new stars and planets. So that the same substance is recirculating, and is really, there is nothing new. Only the forms change. And the atoms from distant galaxies are found in the atoms of our Earth, and therefore in our own physical bodies. So this is the hologram to which we belong and of which we are a part, an inseparable part. And so now I will look at Ben's model of the universe, which he developed having looked at this existing theory of the Big Bang, and which he modified somewhat because what he saw was a different kind of bang, a continuous, modest bang. In the 60s, new celestial bodies were discovered, and they were called quasars. These were radio galaxies of enormous size, the oldest galaxies, the oldest celestial bodies ever observed. And many of them showed a jet emerging from the center and shooting out. These galaxies are the most distant objects ever observed in the universe, and they're the fastest object moving. Here we see the jet emerging. And as I mentioned before, Ben was a great believer in the analogy of the micro level reflecting the macro level. And based on the evidence produced by the quasars, he came up with this model of the universe. What Ben was saying is that actually this is a prototype of what happened in the beginning of the universe, and that the quasars are the chips off the old block, and that cosmic egg, instead of expanding evenly in all directions, or isotropically as it's called, it actually was an explosion in one direction, like a balloon pricked with a needle. And what would happen if you had a jet emerge from this original cosmic egg? There was nothing around it. It was the only thing in that vast void. So this jet would be pulled back in upon itself by this gravitational mass. It would be analogous to holding up a water hose, and the water would eventually fall down and then rise again, and this would be the current that would be established. So it would be a continuous bang, a modest but a continuous bang. Quasars were observed to be not evenly distributed in the observable universe. The observable universe is what we see through our telescopes. If this is our Earth, then this is the radius of the distance where we can make our observations through the existing telescopes. Quasars were observed moving faster and being further away in the north galactic pole. And in the south galactic pole, they were more concentrated and slightly off the true pole by about 30 degrees. So when Ben looked at that, he realized that there was anisotropy. In other words, there was an uneven distribution of quasars. This was an element that somehow contradicted or brought in a new element into the Big Bang theory. And this is what he developed as his own. So this would be the structure then. This is the core of the structure, which is called torus, T-O-R-U-S, a melon-like structure. And matter emerges from the center in the same sequence as we saw before, condensing from light radiation, from photons to stable particles and so on. Then it expands, and visualize this as a three-dimensional form, goes around and gets pulled back in upon itself into the black hole. This is a white hole and a black hole back to back. This is the gravitational collapse as galaxies are pulled in to the black hole and then re-emerge as energy again on another round to go around and around again. And each time matter goes around, it gets refined. Its consciousness is on the next rung of the spiral. This is where Ben would place our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, because quasars were found off the true galactic pole in the south. In other words, he said, we may be looking straight back into the jet here, whereas the other side showed the quasars further away and moving faster. That means that they were entering this expansion where matter is rarefied and goes around. Now, if we equate matter with consciousness, and as I said before, there is nothing but consciousness, and matter is only a form in which consciousness appears. So in that case, the expansion that our galaxy is now entering, the expansion of matter, could also mean the expansion of consciousness. And this could explain perhaps why we are experiencing a certain change in consciousness on this planet. This would be the core of that torus structure. The white hole through which energy emerges, condenses, becomes matter, goes around, gets pulled back into the black hole. And between them is what might be called the singularity point. In physics, it's a situation where laws no longer apply. And here, a transmutation occurs of matter that has condensed to an extreme, and it becomes energy again to re-emerge as a new universe. So one could say that there are several phases to this trip of matter around the torus. Phase one, from energy to matter through expansion. The ultimate expansion is at this point. Then there is condensation and finally a gravitational collapse where the gravitational pull is such that even photons can't escape to tell the story. That's why it's a black hole. As you recall, we talked about the interference pattern of information, which is the hologram. Remember that every speck of matter on the surface of this torus is sending out information about itself. Our galaxy does, and so does a galaxy and many other galaxies which have gone ahead of us. So that the information that is being sent out gets interwoven into one web of information about the entire structure. This is the information that one can tap in those higher states of consciousness and in fact enter the knowledge that's available about the entire structure, because we are a part of this hologram, that little sliver that still retains some of that information, and by tuning into the totality of the hologram, we can have the information about every part of it, and that's exactly what Ben did. Again, the analogy between the macro level and the micro level. This is very similar to the ordinary chicken egg in shape. So what Ben did was to take a chicken egg and attach electrodes to the two ends of it and see if there was any current there. And lo and behold, there was a certain potential there of 2.4 millivolts, very small and yet there. So there is a field around every seed and every egg in nature that we know. In other words, there seems to be the same pattern in this egg as there is in this large torus. So nature tends to repeat a certain design. As an engineer, Ben dealt with structures, and he said there are certain elegant solutions to the problem. So hologram certainly is one for storing information, and this structure seems to be another one that is repeated on different levels. So here is our white hole and black hole and matter circulating round and around. In the center, it's hollow, and it's an electromagnetic field. And we could say that this interference pattern of information could be called the universal mind hologram. And also, the concept of time enters here, because it takes time for matter to go around and for energy in the form of photons, light energy, to become matter. So time becomes a factor of distance of energy as it issues from the white hole and goes around, because time exists when there is motion and where there is mass. So that this is linear time from here to there, one round. This is the birth of time, and this is the death of time. But seen from outside, as we are looking at it now, from another dimension, we see that this is a continuum. And we're looking at it from perhaps an eternal point of view, so that this linear time is a very limited phenomenon in the scheme of things. And it is the force of evolution, again, that keeps driving this along. And Ben used to say that the torus is a distilling column of consciousness, that this structure actually is refining consciousness, which is equivalent to matter, as matter is recirculated through this black and white hole. There is a field like that around the human body, and the different frequencies interact, creating nodes. And also, medicine is moving into a new field, new energy medicine or vibrational medicine. The body is seen as a field of interacting electromagnetic or electric fields. And a new medicine is really emerging. So now we will look at Ben's personal experience through those higher levels of creation. And these he described in his book, which he called A Cosmic Book on the Mechanics of Creation. As I said before, he saw things in terms of structure. So, on that journey into the expanded states of consciousness, it's like a guided tour. You can ask questions and you get answers, and once you understand and you say, okay, I got it, the slide changes, the page is turned, and you're shown new things. So he asked, well, I've seen that model of the universe. In fact, he did perceive it in an expanded state. And then he started figuring out what it's all about. So having seen it, he said, well, it looks like a bounded structure. There must be something beyond it. I want to know. The moment the question is asked, his consciousness finds itself in this vastness of the infinite void, and the process is shown and explained to him. In the vastness of the dark void, a certain part becomes activated. This is where action will take place. And a light describes a certain territory. He called it proto-matter. This is a matrix which will be eventually filled with matter, like the Chinese checkers, which get filled with those little marbles. And this field begins to polarize. As we saw before, the field, the ultimate field of the absolute, which the void is reconciling the opposites. So the opposites of the plus and minus are together. So they begin to separate, and it's like unscrambling scrambled eggs. And the tension is enormous because they don't really want to be separated and they want to come back together again. But this is what creates the dynamics of manifest creation, because you need the polarization in order for action to occur. So what happens next is this. As the two ends want to come together, there is finally a tremendous pull, and one side reaches the other, and a sound actually fills creation. This is the sound, the first word, that creates different frequencies of vibration, and they begin to interact within this structure, and a certain current gets established and starts going around. Then there is a secondary sound, and a droplet is left in the middle. This becomes the focal point of this structure. And this is the white and black hole that we saw before. This is the consciousness whose body this is. The matter of this torus is like an oak tree in relation to the acorn. This center here, the black-white hole, is the consciousness that has the blueprint for this structure. And it's learning through the interaction of its parts, through all the particles that go around and get refined, and their consciousness is getting higher and higher each time around. this point grows in the process. It evolves. And what would you call a consciousness that is in charge of the universe? What is a consciousness whose body the universe is? And as Ben said, well, you would call it a creator. And he didn't know whether to call it a he or a she. He would say, you can't say it's a chairperson of the universe, but it is the creator of the universe who is evolving by experiencing his body in this way. Well, once you have seen this, you want to know more about it, because again, this is a bounded structure, so there must be more. And we, with our finite mind, cannot grasp infinity or eternity, so we want to see what's next. And so the moment you ask, again, the next picture is shown to you and explained. And what you see are more such luminous toroidal shapes appearing in the void. And as you approach, you see that they are arranged in a spiral. 7 universes per each rung of the spiral. This seems like a lot to take in at first, and you begin to count and you realize that there are 7 rungs to the spiral, which means that there are 49 universes. And on top of that structure, there appears to be a very luminous something, and as you approach it closer, this brilliant white light seems to have a shape such as this. And Ben, being familiar with the Hebrew language, looked at that and he said, no, I must be programming myself. This looks like the Hebrew letter Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And immediately the explanation comes. No, this is not a Hebrew letter. This is an interference pattern of 4 energies interacting on this level, on this cosmic level. And they create this pattern, which is a consciousness whose body this is. This consciousness contains the consciousnesses of all the 49 creators. In other words, consciousness is modular. As we saw before with the ducks, a more evolved consciousness, a larger consciousness, will contain the lesser ones. As Ben was looking at all these things, he said, I'm just a tourist. I'm snapping pictures and bringing them back. I don't know what I'm looking at. And I'm just one of you all. We're all on this cosmic journey on a bus, except some of us have window seats and some have aisle seats. I happen to have a window seat, so I can share with you what I'm observing. So he had no explanations for these except that he was seeing something and then asking questions. So as he approached this Aleph a little closer, what he saw was that the front of it was a brilliant white light, and the back was dark, and it looked rather three-dimensional. It's a hologram. And there are 22 such forms, interference patterns, emerging from the luminous side. And they look exactly like the Hebrew letters. And he was explained again that these are interference patterns that were observed by seers in antiquity, and they incorporated them into the Hebrew letters, into the Hebrew alphabet, but they are there objectively to be observed. On the other side, the same forms emerge, but in a random, mixed-up order. And he was explained that these interference patterns are transducers of the Aleph energy down to the physical level. They step it down further and further to the physical level. And this whole diagram actually illustrates the law of the cosmic level, because what it's really saying that evil is simply ignorance of the law. The proper sequence of these characters is knowledge of the law, but a mixed-up order is ignorance of the law, which then becomes evil. And what is the law? And when you ask the question, you're shown. Close up, this is the structure. The aleph breaks itself down into 3 centers, 3 chakras, each one having these interference patterns in them, which look like Hebrew letters, and each Hebrew letter has an equivalent numerical value, so that everything is actually modular and structured. Each center has its own frequency in terms of color. The center, which is love, Ya, is gold. The center representing the will, Kol, is blue, and the center representing the creation is pink. When Ben looked at that, he realized that the white light of the aleph representing wisdom is a combination of all these colors. And these are actually frequencies active on that level which create these holograms. Now, the law that we talked about before, the cosmic law operative on this level, is interpreted in a very ingenious way. These characters, which then became the Hebrew language, can be read in different directions and mean opposite things. If you read from left to right, it reads Heilech, which means go, or it's a green light. In other words, you can act safely if you act from love towards will. But if you act from will to love, self-will, before you know love, then it reads klaya. And in Hebrew, it means destruction or extinction. So that is the cosmic law. The cosmic law is love, and the ignorance of the cosmic law then causes destruction. And the creative center, read in opposite directions, means in the beginning there was the desire for life. Having seen this, you want to see the entire structure, and this is what you see. The aleph and his 49 creators is enclosed in a sphere very similar to a biological cell. And in fact, it's like a DNA coil, and it does split at the end when this unit is mature. So, having seen this and the current constantly circulating around this, you want to break out and you want to see what's beyond that. But you keep bumping into this wall and you can't get out. When finally you do break through, this is what you see. You are surrounded by more cosmoses, and they're pressing against each other like frogs' eggs. And you're caught in this structure. It looks like a biological structure. So, again, you want to know where it's all leading you, and you go through this structure, and this is what you find. There is a term in biology, close-packed structure. In other words, if you take a cell, you can only put 6 of the same size around it. And on top of that, you can only fit 3 so that they would be stable. And on top of that, only 1. So that from the side view, it will appear like this. It will be 1 on top of 3 on top of 7. And it will look like a pyramid with a triangular side on all sides, which is called tetrahedron. Now, what's interesting about that is that in physics, there is something known as fine structure constant, and it is 137. It is a method which demonstrates how atoms differ from each other. It determines the size of an atom because it determines the tension and the interaction between the electron and the nucleus. So it's interesting to note that the first stable structure on the cosmic level is a tetrahedron, and we, on our physical plane here on Earth, have the diamond, which is the strongest substance we know, and it has a tetrahedral molecular structure. So there is perhaps a resonance here with the cosmic level, and that's why the diamond, is the strongest substance we know. And then these units of tetrahedrons form modules of two such tetrahedrons joined together, and this is how that field of cosmoses, the frog's eggs, is formed. Once you break out of that soup of cosmoses, you discover that they are contained in turn in a yet larger sphere, so that one structure is within another. And as you examine it closer, you see that in the center of this, perhaps you should call it supercosmos, there is a hollow. And inside that, cosmos shells are being formed, and they emerge from that and evolve towards the surface. Whereas the Aleph's spiral has all those universes on the spiral evolving up towards the Aleph. So here, the cosmoses in turn evolve towards the surface of the supercosmos. And the mature cosmoses then emerge on the outside. They begin to cluster together and form a new supercosmos, and they kind of elbow their way in, pushing the other ones aside. And you see that this is a growing, almost biological structure. Now, on every level of these structures that you perceive, there is a consciousness in charge. The Aleph was in charge of the cosmos. And here on the level of the supercosmos, this form appears. And in order for you to know that it's a consciousness that you can interact with, a face or a likeness of a face will appear in it and say, I can talk to you. And in order to understand what it's saying, you merge with it, and then you begin to understand a little more about that level. And here I would like to digress a little bit to talk about consciousness, because there appear to be two types of consciousness. One that is the consciousness of the structure itself, and the other that uses that structure as a temporary dwelling. If we look at our own bodies, and for example, we talk to the cell of our kidney, and we ask the kidney cell, what is it that you do? What is your job here? The kidney cell will say, I don't really know. I'm just a little fellow here. Why don't you ask the boss? Now, who is the boss? It's the sum total of all the cells of the kidney. And it already is a consciousness that you can interact with. And the kidney will tell you, well, I purify blood, I do this and I do that. And so every organ in our body is a sum total of the consciousnesses of the cells that compose it. And then there appears to be a consciousness which is the sum total of all the consciousnesses of all the organs. And you could say that it's perhaps a rudimentary consciousness, if you can call it that, of the body. It runs the body when it is unconscious. In other words, the other consciousness is away. When you sleep, when you are under anesthesia, there's somebody running your body. Somebody is breathing. The lungs know what they're doing. The heart continues to pump blood. It is conscious, and it's unrelated to the consciousness that is temporarily away. So the same thing happens on every level. There is a consciousness of the structure itself and another one that uses that structure and can come and go. So we can also say the same thing about our Earth, for example. It's a conscious being, and there is a consciousness that runs the planet. Its electromagnetic field, its temperature, its currents, and other things, the ecology of the planet. And then there must be another consciousness which uses it as a garage, as Ben used to put it. And it can come and go. It's a much larger consciousness. And so it's true of the sun and of every other level as you go up. So Ben perceived these consciousnesses as abstract forms that would appear on different levels, and they would communicate with you, and you can learn from them. We saw this on the supercosmic level. Then comes the Ankh, the cross, the two triangles, the two crossing, and then something that looks a little bit like the Egyptian pharaoh, the first human form that runs the 7th level. There were 7 levels in all, and each level ever simpler, ever larger, and comprising the levels that were below it. As I said, consciousness is modular. So, as you go through all these levels, finally, you come to a level where all these levels are contained in one sphere, the manifest creation. Everything visible and invisible, everything that ever existed is in it. And around it is this infinite dark void, which is the consciousness itself. And as it vibrates, as we saw before, it creates manifest creation. So as you come closer to this, you begin to discern what appear to be rotating disks covering its surface. And as you look closer, this is what you see. Instead of disks, you see that these are bars having little shapes underneath like that. And these bars spin around. These shapes spin around. And there are 3 layers of these. And the 4th, the outermost layer, looks like this. And you begin to recognize these as shapes known as the Sanskrit letters, and then this one as the symbol which stands for Om, or cosmic consciousness in Sanskrit. So again, you're explained when you ask about it, these are not Sanskrit letters. These are holograms, interference patterns that are active on that level, and they were perceived by the seers and incorporated into the Sanskrit alphabet. So, as you look at this manifest creation, you realize that there must be a consciousness that runs this, the ultimate consciousness. And you want to understand how this structure is run and what's happening with these rotating disks. And you are explained that as this cell or as this being grows, and we saw that it's constantly expanding and developing and evolving, it expands into the surrounding void, which is pure consciousness, as we remember. So that as it expands into it, the void begins to penetrate it. And these rotating disks are acting as modulators of the void. And by rotating, they create a sound, the word of creation, which then begins to interact within itself. It's a hologram of sound or a hologram of different frequencies that begin to create all kinds of harmonics and all kinds of additional sounds that develop out of these interactions of different frequencies. And so the whole thing is forever evolving. So then you ask, so who is the top God? Who runs this structure? And the moment you ask, you find yourself in the infinite void, and suddenly a brilliant light comes down on you, so brilliant that you're blinded and you're shaking, because now you realize you are talking to the ultimate God of the structure. So what do? You peek under and you realize that this is a tunnel of light. So you enter that and you begin to ascend, and you go faster and faster, and in fact you begin to tumble down faster and faster, and then you realize that it's making a U-turn, and at the end there is something there, and you know that that is it, and you will soon be confronting the God of manifest creation. As you finally look at it, you realize that you are looking at yourself, a carbon copy of yourself. But that self sits there paying no attention to you and you're lost. You don't know what to say to yourself. How's the weather up there? What do you say to yourself? So, you revert to your old tested trick. You merge with yourself so that by merging, you can know yourself and you can find out what it's all about. So, you turn around and you slowly back into yourself like into a tight garage. And when you finally do, what happens is that there is a tremendous bang and you become the void. Because you are the consciousness, which is the void. And that part of you that had never left has always been the void. And that observer that was watching through your eyes and guiding you through this obstacle course to go back to yourself, your higher self, was the observer that had never left and was watching you creating this whole phantasmagoria for yourself. We each create our own. And it's just a trip back home to reunite with your own self. And so we could say that we are the creators, the producers, and the consumers of our own reality because we are the consciousness itself. And Ben liked to finish his talks by quoting a poem by an Indian sage, Shankara, which went like this. On the vast canvas of the self, the picture of manifold worlds is painted by the self itself. And that supreme self, seeing but itself, enjoys great delight.